Greetings. As this is the Christmas season, I hope to put out at least a couple different Christmas-related videos, this week and maybe next week and so on, maybe even a few such videos. But in this first video, I'd like to very briefly, ever so briefly, explore the idea of pagan parallels and share what might be a fun potential example. So tonight is the Northern Hemisphere's winter solstice, which happens to be the shortest day of the year and therefore the longest night of the year. And among many Iranis and Afghanis and Tajiks and Azeris and Kurds, it marks the Persian celebration known as Yalda. At this point, it might be easy for a modern Western mind to simply think, Persians celebrating the winter solstice? That sure sounds pagan, and any similarity this might have to Christmas is probably another sign of that pagan borrowing we hear so much about. But in this video, I'd like to propose that things might not be that simple and offer a little bit of food for thought. And now, if I can go on a bit of a segue, a bit of a tangent, if you will, just for a moment, here's something else that inspired this video. I was at the bookstore and I stumbled across this graphic novel. It's in Spanish, a Spanish graphic novel based on the Gospel of Matthew, titled Verso a Verso, Biblia Comic, El Evangelio según Mateo. Apparently, it's a Spanish translation of an English graphic novel titled Word for Word, but unfortunately, I haven't come across the English original yet. I just stumbled across the Spanish one recently. But whatever the case, putting language aside, when I was flipping through the book, I found the depiction of the wise men visiting the infant Christ striking. You see, the illustrator, whose name is Simon Amadeus Pilario, that illustrator made a subtle yet, in my opinion, thought-provoking choice. And that was to depict the wise men as wearing Phrygian caps. Those are those soft hats with the blunt points leaning forward. Now, the reason why this is interesting is because many of the depictions of Mithra, or some say Mithras, many of the depictions of Mithra have him likewise wearing a Phrygian cap. The illustrator's decision to depict the wise men as dressed like popular ancient depictions of Mithra raises the question, what might that illustrator have intended by that? Now, I confess up front that I don't know what the illustrator intended, but it's still interesting. Now, while the Phrygian cap itself is not typically associated with Persia, it is nonetheless worth noting that the character of Mithra apparently originated in Persia, and so too the biblical wise men, sometimes called the Magi in English, or los magos in Spanish, and majus in Arabic, are also understood to be from Persia. In fact, to this day, that Arabic word, majus, is often used to mean Zoroastrian. Now, why might this be significant? Well, recall that in the second chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, the wise men, the Magi, are able to discern that Christ has been born, and they did this apparently by reading allusions to Christ's birth in the heavens. Now, I want you to think about the implications of that. The Bible hints rather loudly that certain non-Jews, apparently Persians, maybe not limited to Persians, but certain non-Jews were able to see references to Christ in creation. Now, people could apparently glean allusions to Christ in the heavens, which raises a question, might everyone who could read such understand it fully, or might there have been only partial understandings? Now, with that in mind, that aforementioned term, Yalda, the name of the celebration of the winter solstice in Persian-speaking areas, might arguably be akin to a biblical term. It might actually be a biblical term in a sense. You see, when Yalda is written in Farsi's use of the Arabic script, it's spelled Ya, Lam, Dal, Alif. The corresponding characters in the Phoenician, Hebrew, or Syriac scripts would be Yod, Lamed, Dalet, Aleph. And speaking of Syriac, let's now turn to the Peshitta, the ancient Syrian Aramaic translation of the Bible. Now, I'd like to turn to specifically Isaiah 9:6, the famous verse which reads in English, "A child is born to us," or as the Hebrew of the Masoretic text puts it, Yeled Yulad Lanu. When you look that verse up in the Peshitta, the relevant portions read, De Yalda it Yeled Lan. Now, disregarding that prefix Dalet, that word, Yalda, meaning the child, is spelled precisely the same way as the name of the winter solstice celebration in Persian, in Farsi, Yalda. You see, the reality is that Aramaic used to be widely spoken in ancient Persia, and many suspect that the current feast may have actually gotten its name from Nestorian Christians who were living in, Iran or other Persian areas. In short, it isn't always non Christians influencing Christians. Rather, sometimes that influence goes in the opposite direction. But the question of the name of this Persian celebration, Yalda, putting that question aside, we can talk more generally in this way. If there are any similarities between Christian beliefs about Christ and the beliefs found amongst various ancient non Christian cults, such as, for example, the Mithra cult, why should we be surprised or scandalized? Why should we find that surprising or scandalous? If the Bible teaches us that allusions to the Christian truth could be gleaned from the heavens, then really, honestly, you have to ask, what is implausible about non Christians and even pre Christian populations grasping such, but only grasping it vaguely, and then mixing the little bit that they grasped with their own accretions and falsehoods? Christians, here's a quick analogy in that regard. Christians well understand that the Christian faith can not only reflect the Jewish scriptures, but so too even extra scriptural Jewish tradition. And it's also recognized that the Christian faith can serve as the lens via which one can glean the deeper truths within both Jewish scripture and Jewish tradition, separating, as far as the Jewish tradition is concerned, separating truth from falsehood. At least that's the Christian perspective. And so with that in mind, what then precludes a similar system applying to non-Jewish populations? What precludes the Christian faith, which is for all mankind, from likewise providing the lens via which one can parse the many traditions that exist amongst ancient non-Jewish cultures? Honestly, that's a bit of food for thought. But anyone who's interested in this line of reasoning might also enjoy my video titled Prisca Theologia from last February, and I'll share a link in the video description. On that note, as always, I look forward to the comments of others. God bless.